Hi there. I'm going to talk very briefly today. I've got two videos to share with you and a document. The document is an impact assessment of the government's transgender guidelines, which have been issued to all schools in Scotland. So I attended a talk last week in Falkland, and the videos are the recordings of that at the time. The talk was given by two women. One is a concerned lawyer called Eva and the other heads up an organisation called Women and Girls of Scotland, and that's Maren Smith. Now, Women and Girls in Scotland was set up to basically protect the rights of women and girls. So Women and Girls Scotland were concerned about the rights of women and girls, and they've undertaken to review policies and proposals that have come through from the government with a view to providing impact assessments that can be used by organisations. Now, they identified supporting transgender young people as a document that warranted reviewing. They used a children's rights-based approach, and it was produced using an impact assessment model that was developed by the Children and Young Persons Commissioner of Scotland. The findings of the rights impact assessment were that the document is unlawful and not fit for purpose. Schools are legally obliged to assess any impact on pupils when they adopt new guidelines, and that's in line with the public sector equality duty. Now, within these guidelines, there's no mention of that duty, and further, it doesn't make clear to head teachers that it's not being done. So the responsibility and legal risks associated with teaching this in the curriculum rest solely with head teachers. Now, self-ID for adults, you have to be 18, you have to have a medical diagnosis, and you have to have lived as that gender for 2 years. That's the current regulations. The government are looking to reduce that down. So you would be required to be 16, no medical diagnosis whatsoever, and you would only have had to live as that gender for 6 months. Within schools, children will be allowed to self-ID from the age of 4, and that information is kept secret from parents if the child wishes it to be. We feel this is a huge infringement, not only on the children's rights, but on the rights of parents, and that's children who identify as transgender and children who don't, because everyone needs protecting. Now, within the guidance, I'll just read a little bit here. It says, the guidance undoubtedly has the best interests of transgender young people as its primary consideration. However, it is not clear that the interests of other young people who are not trans have also been given due consideration. The impact assessment is 50 pages long, and I've read it, and I have to agree with Maren. It's not well thought out. It doesn't consider children who are not transgender, and it's not considering girls. Now, under international law, put aside the guidance itself, under international law, parents and girls and children have rights that are protected. That's out with guidelines that the government have provided here. Now, when I attended the talk, it was really well attended. There was a lot of teachers there were a lot of parents. People talked about situations where girls are not drinking anything all day, not going to the toilet. If they have a period, they don't want to go to school. They feel intimidated in bathrooms. You know, it goes on and on. And what we would like to just make very clear to parents is that you do have rights. You can complain, and you must complain. You must complain to school, and if you get nowhere with them, complain to your MSPs. So at present, under the Equality Act 2010, I'm just going to read this out as well. Young people are entitled to single-sex provision in order to protect their right to privacy, dignity and safety. In recommending a blanket policy where transgender young people are allowed to use the facilities they are most comfortable with, take part in the sporting category they are most comfortable with, and to share overnight accommodation with young people of the opposite sex, this guidance could jeopardise their rights. Now, if you want to look at the guidance itself, which is attached, that's on page 12. On pages 35 to 37, you get a breakdown of how those rights are potentially impacted. Now, this guidance was initially endorsed by the Children and Young People's Commissioner of Scotland. After Maren produced the impact assessment, they had lawyers look over the document. The lawyers agreed with Maren, and this endorsement was withdrawn. Okay. The Scottish Government then had lawyers look over this document. Those lawyers also agreed with Maren, yet the government published the guidelines. The government said that not publishing the guidelines risked damaging the reputation of the guidance. Now, why is the government publishing something that it knows is not lawful and can potentially have consequences for children? And why is it publishing a document that may result in child protection issues? So the government is putting guidance reputation above safety of our children and above the law. So this guidance fails on all three counts. It's not protecting children who identify as transgender, it's not protecting all the other children, and it's not protecting the rights of parents. How can we as parents protect our children if this is kept a secret from us? We need to know if our children are vulnerable. We as parents need to know, because we are the best placed to protect them and to advocate for them. And the sharing of information is at the very heart of the government's own safeguarding framework, getting it right for every child. And under the UN Convention on the Rights of Every Child, they have a right to privacy, they have a right to dignity, and they have a right to boundaries. So if your daughter is not going to school because she has a period and she doesn't want to use the bathrooms, or she's not having a drink all day, or she's not using the bathroom, you need to start complaining to the school. And if the school do nothing, complain to your MSPs. But keep complaining, because you have rights as parents and we need to start exercising those rights. We as parents have the right to champion our own children's best interests. Parents are not a risk just because they may not agree with a child who identifies as the opposite sex. And these guidelines are very hostile to parents on that basis. And we should be asking the question, who created these guidelines? Now, it was co-authored by various groups, including LGBT Scotland and Scottish Trans Alliance. Now, James Morton is the manager of Scottish Trans Alliance. He co-authored the impact assessment that saw men who identify as women introduced into the female prison estate. That impact assessment deemed there was no risk to women. And that's demonstrably untrue. Men are causing a lot of problem to vulnerable women in prison right now. Now, throughout the guidance, there's multiple occasions where it's mentioned, if someone complains, this is what you do. So if a girl complains that she's uncomfortable in a bathroom, you have to speak to the parent and basically tell the parent that they need to be respectful and inclusive. Girls who've been maybe sexually abused, they will not want to share with boys, however they identify. The binding of breasts is considered self-harm, and the government, in these guidelines, the government is promoting that. The assessment says that there's a 96% correlation between being transgender and having mental health problems. We can't ignore this You know, we can't ignore that fact. And I think endorsing breast binding, and I'll just read this part, it says, if a child in the school says they want to live as a different gender, it is important to provide support and listen to what they are saying. Teachers in schools should be confident in discussing this with the child and, with the child's consent, their family. Now, if the child does not want to discuss this, because they might be too young, they don't really understand, that's the school keeping secrets from parents. The young person could also be in a situation where they're being groomed. And if schools are not willing to discuss this information with parents, you know, that abuse will continue. And for teachers to take at face value something that a 4-year-old might say, and then deny the parents any input into the well-being of their own child, that's wrong.
Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you don't mind, but I'm not going to stand up, because I'll just walk, which is not good. Right, so as Eleanor just said, we've been causing the government some trouble by writing this impact assessment, which no one who is actually paid to safeguard children in Scotland saw fit to do. We're not paid to do this, we're not child safeguarding experts. We just did this in our own spare time. It took us 6 months. We worked with the Children and Young Persons Commissioner in Scotland, who had endorsed the original LGBT youth guidance that was supposed to advise teachers on how to treat children who identify as trans in Scottish schools. And we had a bit of bother with the Children's Rights Commissioner, because we delivered our assessment and they had promised to give us feedback. And our assessment is that the guidance that the Scottish Government paid for and endorsed and sent to all schools wasn't lawful. The Children's Commissioner had their lawyers on it for a few months to try and find fault with it, because they also endorsed the guidance. They couldn't find any. So we showed that the guidance that the Scottish Government had sent to schools wasn't lawful and would lead to breaching the rights of children under UK law and international human rights law, which was a problem for the Children's Commissioner, because they endorsed it. So they withdrew all support, but we were told from within the Children's Commissioner's office to publish as fast as we could, and forced their hand in this way. They never acknowledged us, but they did write to the Scottish Government to say, please make sure that whatever guidance you send to schools is lawful. Now, the Scottish Government didn't acknowledge us either. However, they got their own legal advice on the guidance they paid for, and that legal advice agreed with us. What they paid for and endorsed wasn't legal. So we asked them, could you please write to all local authorities in Scotland and ask them to stop using this guidance, which we had shown wasn't legal and would lead to the rights of children being violated? And they said no, because that would risk damaging the reputation of the guidance. So a piece of paper is officially more important to the Scottish Government than the damage done to children. So here we are. We caused trouble, we made them write new guidance. This is the new guidance. It's 70 pages of really confusing, really confused, contradictory guidance that will lead teachers to, once again, violate the rights of children. Now, the guidance set out to meet the needs of children who identify as trans, to respect the rights of all children, especially girls, and to respect the rights of parents. It fails on all 3 counts. And throughout the guidance, it is astonishingly hostile to parents. It absolutely refuses to acknowledge that parents actually have rights to champion their children's best interests. And that unless there is an identified safeguarding risk, most parents cannot simply be assumed to be a risk to their children just because they might not agree with a child saying, I think I'm a boy, or I think I'm a girl. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what is wrong with the guidance, but the very first thing I'm going to tell you is that if you take one thing away from today, I hope it is that you need to complain to the schools. You need to keep complaining, because repeatedly in this document, the Scottish Government says, if a child complains, then try and solve this problem by respecting the rights of all children. Now, the default position should really be meet the rights of all children, not just when someone complains. You should really be teaching, everybody, staff, teachers, and the children, that they all have rights and they can expect to have these rights met. However, because this comes up repeatedly, if someone complains, if someone has a problem, then meet the rights of all children. What this really tells me is we need to complain. Whenever there's a situation that you're not happy with because your child's not happy with it, you need to complain. There's a problem with it, with having to complain, but if you feel confident enough to do it, if you're in a position where you can complain, then I would absolutely urge you to do it. Even if you don't feel confident complaining to the school, talk to your MSPs. You have 8 of them, and if you have any conservative MSPs, they're actually surprisingly clued up about this by now, because we've been chewing their ears off about it for years. So they will know. And what all MSPs keep telling us is we can't raise this as an issue unless we have constituents coming to us with an issue. So if you're not happy talking to the school, talk to an MSP. That's confidential. They will not give away your name. They will not give away your child's name or anything like that, but they can try and at least raise your concerns. So I am going to I think you're probably aware of the one aspect of this guidance that hit the news, which is that 4-year-olds can change how they identify at school without the permission of their parents, and without this guidance actually telling teachers that they must inform the parents about this, which is actually a really serious problem. And the reason why I'm saying this guidance contradicts itself is because there's a whole part in here about the needs of children who identify as trans to be supported by their parents and to have access to support in a timely manner. That can't happen if you don't tell the parents. So it's a little bit bonkers, to be, on the one hand, emphasising how vulnerable these children are, and on the other hand, to emphasise that we must not tell the parents that their children might be vulnerable. It does, of course, conflict with getting it right for every child, which is the safeguarding framework used in Scottish schools, which puts information sharing at the heart of safeguarding, which has very strict protocols about when parents can be excluded from information. It's actually very rare, even where there is a safeguarding concern, and if social care is involved or any other agencies, even then, information sharing with parents is still paramount. And this is because in the most harrowing cases, every case review has found that information sharing, or I should say failures in information sharing, is at the heart of where things go wrong. So you already all know about the 4-year-olds who can decide that they're really the other sex, if they want to. And some bits you might have missed is this guidance ignores child development. It ignores the normal development of children, which, well, we don't live in a utopia yet where sex stereotypes and sex role stereotypes do not matter. So in a lot of ways, children, especially in primary school, have sex-based friendship groups. All the girls together, all the boys together. Which is why it is very concerning, I'm just going to try and find my, yes, which is why it is very concerning that when it talks about transphobic bullying, the things that make up transphobic bullying include the following: excluding someone from conversations, activities, and games. So if you have a 10-year-old boy who identifies as a girl, and the girls will not include him in their games because it's a girls' group, they don't really want to play with boys, then this could be, if you're very unlucky, framed as transphobic bullying. A perfectly normal, I mean, my son, my youngest son, I don't even think that he would have considered girls as playmates. He still doesn't. He's 14. He's on the cusp of other things. But he has never had any interest in having any friendships with girls whatsoever. And that's nothing to do with, you know, kind of disrespecting them. He's just not interested. That's a normal childhood thing which happens in societies like ours, where we have a lot of stereotypes about what girls and boys should be doing. The next thing, which I really find worrying, the next item is gestures, looks, and other non-verbal communications can also be transphobic bullying. Now remember, please, we're talking about 4-year-olds who have all kinds of weird things that they will look at you for. It's ridiculous that these things should have been listed in here without an acknowledgement of the different ages and age groups. And when it is appropriate to maybe say to kids, look, we don't do this. We don't exclude someone from conversations when they're walking into a room when you're not in a girls' group. But the last item in this list is deliberately using the wrong name and or pronoun. Now this is a problem in 2 ways. There's a difference between using someone's chosen name or refusing to use someone's chosen name and refusing to use pronouns. For starters, it's confusing because the Scottish Government has seen fit to include neopronouns and changing pronouns in this list. So if you have children who like to go by she, her on Monday, and he, him on Tuesday, and they, them on Wednesday, you are obliged to follow this all the way down to 4-year-old. I mean, a lot of these things are just absolutely ludicrous and not practical. They are going to create conflict where there shouldn't be any conflict. And if you think this isn't going to happen, I would recommend you go onto Mumsnet and start reading the threads where parents are complaining. My child has been disciplined because she has a friend who changes her pronouns daily and she cannot keep up with it. And the child who is indulged in this pronoun preference is having meltdowns, talking about being disrespected. Transphobia has been mentioned. And it's something that the schools could handle in a very different manner, but it's framed here as bullying, which is a real problem. I have not mentioned at this point the problems that some children who are autistic, for instance, might be having in using the wrong pronoun for someone or the wrong name for someone. If you've known a boy for 5 years as Paul, and suddenly you're supposed to call him she, her, and Paula, that can cause problems to children. And this is not acknowledged in this guidance. They do talk about people trying their best and making a mistake, but where are you with children who absolutely will not use the wrong pronoun because it just simply does not work for them? Yes, it's black and white thinking, but autistic children are prone to that. So where are we when we weigh up the rights of different groups of children? According to the Scottish Government, that's all fine until you complain. And as I said before, the problem with asking or telling teachers that they only need to consider the rights of all children when somebody complains, if I can find my little thing. Okay, right. Is the following. So it says here, for instance, on page 28, if the complaint relates to another young person who identifies that they will experience disadvantage as a result, then the school should seek to respect the rights of all. Now, that's actually the end of the long process. You have to have, let's say, you have an 11-year-old girl who's not comfortable changing with a 17-year-old boy in the changing room at secondary school. So you have to have a girl who is confident enough to raise this issue. Then she has to out herself as having a problem. But the children are being taught that it isn't kind to have a problem with this, that they need to be respectful of identities. There's a lot in here about respecting identity. So what option does she have? She can try and assert herself, which is, I mean, you have to be a very confident 11-year-old to do that. And I was really bossy and really bullshit at that age, and I'm not sure I would have done it. The other option, of course, is that you can ask your parents to do it for you. And here is the Scottish Government's response. If young people or their parents' carers express concerns about sharing toilets or changing rooms with a transgender young person, it may be because they are concerned that the transgender young person may behave inappropriately. In this instance, schools should seek to dispel any misconceptions. A transgender young person's presence does not constitute inappropriate behaviour. Well, I beg to differ. If we're talking about a boy in a girl's changing room or toilet, that in itself can cause a problem, even if that boy never behaves inappropriately, because girls have a right to privacy and dignity. And unfortunately, a story hit the news this week about a father in the US who tried to raise an assault on his daughter by a boy who only managed to access the girls' toilets because he was wearing a dress as an issue. The only person so far who's been convicted of anything is the father, who raised this as an issue. The boy subsequently went on to assault another girl. So to categorically state that no transgender young person would behave inappropriately, I mean, it just goes against all safeguarding principles that we have, that we use for everything. I mean, if you want to work in a school, you have to go and have a disclosure certificate. You have to apply for a disclosure certificate. I had to apply for one. Did I feel that was a personal slight, some sort of insinuation that I'm a criminal? No. I'm happy to do it because we're trying as best we can to safeguard children. And the way we do this is by applying certain safeguarding principles, one of which at schools is to have single-sex facilities above, I think it's the age of 8 in Scotland. So, again, the Scottish Government writes here, if a young person raises a concern regarding sharing facilities with a transgender young person, and it is established that they will experience disadvantage as a result, then the school should seek to respect the rights of all, but only then. Even though we actually have established in law under the Equality Act and various other the building regulations in Scotland for school buildings, for instance, which stipulate that we must have single-sex facilities. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which gives children a right to privacy. All of these things would suggest that if schools really wanted to meet the needs of all children and respect the rights of all children, they would maintain single-sex facilities. However, the Scottish Government's not happy with any of this, and it goes on to attack single-sex facilities by saying there is no law that bans a man from women's toilets and no law that bans a woman from man's toilets, which is correct. But it's disinformation, because once we have single-sex facilities, and we're only allowed to have them on the basis of sex, thanks to the Equality Act, which allows us to exclude people from an opposite-sex space if we have shown that there's a good reason to have that space in the first place, then actually we can exclude a male person from a female-only space, or vice versa. And we can actually treat boys and girls differently on the basis of sex, and that's allowed. But as I said, the Scottish Government's clearly not happy about this. It suggests things like putting up modesty curtains, and which is just ridiculous. It goes on. Sport. We should allow a transgender young person to take part within the sports group which matches their gender identity. Now, the Scottish Government also has, rather beautifully, got a pilot project which attempted to increase girls' participation in sport. One of the first things they identified was girls want their own sports. They don't want to do sports with boys. They want to be listened to. Unfortunately, joined-up thinking in this area is not really a strength of the Scottish Government. So here you have, if a boy identifies as a girl and he wants to compete, he wants to have his PE classes with the girls, he gets to do it. A non-binary child, they can just choose whatever group they're most comfortable with. Presumably, since gender fluid, as in someone who changes, is also mentioned in this could also change from week to week. And one of the problems that we have throughout this is the Scottish Government has certain obligations to combat sex stereotypes and sex role stereotypes. It wants to incorporate the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women into Scots law. And one of the mainstays of this convention is that they have identified that stereotypical beliefs about what women should do, what is appropriate for them to do, what is not appropriate for them to do, can form the basis of discrimination against women. So therefore, the Scottish Government has committed to combating sex stereotypes and sexual stereotypes. The problem, however, is that they can't make up their mind as to how you do this, and they really can't do it if they also allow us to teach children that if a girl likes football, she might be a boy. And there are some definitions in here which are quite concerning, because what I would want from a document like this is a little bit of an impartial voice in here. But the Scottish Government talks about children being assigned a sex at birth. And it talks about gender non-conformity being different from being trans, but it can't really identify it. The Scottish Government does not have a child-friendly definition of gender identity. I can of course tell you why. We don't have to play games about this. If you write a child-friendly definition of gender identity, the only thing you can talk about is stereotypes. If you like short hair, if you like football, if you like blue, you might be a boy. And if you like dolls and you want to wear a dress, you might actually be a girl, even if you were born there. That's a real problem. It confuses the whole thing. So this isn't impartial, this is steeped in ideology. And that's not a good thing when you take it into schools. Now, until now, we have been absolutely abandoned by anybody who should care about children. But in September, the only union for secondary school teachers in Scotland published a statement saying this guidance is actually putting teachers at risk of breaking the law and being sued. It's useless, it should be changed or withdrawn, but it isn't fit for purpose. And that's something that was a very brave statement to do. I have not been able to find it anywhere, so I don't know if they withdrew it, if they stand by it. But it's the first time teachers have actually said, this isn't good enough for us. And the real problem they have is that this guidance emphasises it's non-statutory, which means that it's not binding for schools to use, but it gives them advice on how to deal with these issues. But then it goes on to say that you need to get your own legal advice to make sure you are not breaching the rights of children. School budget, yes. Well, the other problem is, if that's what you want to do, if you want to give advice, you need to fairly and accurately represent the law and not put things in here that conflict with it, like saying there is no law in Scotland that bans a man from a woman's toilet, because that's irrelevant. We actually have certain legal instruments that allow us to have single-sex spaces. That's how it works. We don't have to have a law that bans a man from a woman's toilet in order to have female-only toilets, and in order to be able to exclude all male people from that. But for whatever reason, the Scottish Government wrote it in this way because we're quite sure they have read this, but they've never acknowledged our assessment, and they certainly don't agree with it, because they have, word for word, taken passages out of the original guidance and put it in here.
What about local councils?
Yes.
I suppose local councils, they have their own legal departments. Has there been any feedback from them?
Well, did you
I was going to say, I wrote to Carrie Lindsay, who's the head of education for Fife Council, to invite her to our meetings. I wrote to her twice, and her response was that it wouldn't be appropriate for her to attend or her colleagues, and she advised that parents take it up with their schools individually. But my argument was, like, how can they if there isn't any information out there, and that's why this meeting was called in the first place. So.
My experience was through the West Coast, And my granddaughter, who's now 9, when she was 5, she started primary school, and it was boys' toilets and girls' toilets, right? When she went to primary 2, they'd all been changed over the summer holidays without a word, to any of the parents, right? When my daughter was a bit upset about it, and she was trying to speak, to the other parents, and she asked for a meeting, with the head teacher, like, with some of the parents. But that's not what they do, right? What they do is they pick off the parents one at a time, and when she went into the meeting, there was the head teacher and 2 senior members of staff to re-educate her, right, as to why she thought this so seriously wrong. My eldest granddaughter's 9 now, and she hasn't set foot in a toilet in school ever since that happened. And that wee girl leaves the house at 8:15 in the morning, doesn't get home till 3:15 in the afternoon, and actually doesn't drink in school, right, because she doesn't want to go to the toilets. Now, as a mother of 7 sons, right, I was used to my boys, like, can I get into the toilet 2 at a time and using no hands? And you always had a mop bucket and that, like round about them. And I said, what's the problem, sweetheart? And she went, oh, Mum, Granny, she said, the boys pee on the seats and they leave the doors open. Right, you can't get any peace and the doors are getting shoved open and everything else like that. But do you know what Eastwood Local Authority did in East Renfrewshire? They forgot to put sanitary boxes in the toilets for the primary 7s that might have been menstruating. So these wee girls were coming out of a toilet, no sanitary box, right, and having to wash their hands in front of boys.
Yeah.
Right, I think that's utterly disgraceful. Right, and what I really object to is, instead of these head teachers, directors of education, MSPs, coming to meetings and explaining what they've done and why, right, shoving parents to the one side as if they don't matter. Right, and I just think to myself, wait a minute, you work for me, I don't work for you, and you better start getting some answers here. Pronto.
What about parent councils?
Well, for any of you that saw Tweed Street, right, the other night, what's actually been happening is Scottish Government, when they did the consultation, it was with LGBT youth, it was with Stonewall Youth, it was with the Scottish Trans Alliance, it was with Engender, right? Every one of them are groups for adults, right? None of them for kids. They had over 200 meetings, right, with Shirley Ann Somerville, right, and John Spinney, with not a parent representative there, with not a women's representative there. No, I beg your pardon, we have the Parents Forum, that's their hand-picked crowd.
They refused to meet us,
That's their hand-picked crowd, is the Parents Forum.
despite asking for it for 3 years.
And at this meeting, right, there was a parent stood up, kind of thing, and he was talking, excuse the language, but I mean, this is what happened, right? And he was talking about, he asked John Spinney to say that he was re-endorsing these materials, and he said, well, what about anal sex, Mr. Spinney? He said, what about things like licking the anus? And the parents forum who had been organising the meeting, you have seen them, they're running over, they're trying to pull the microphone off.
Hi, yeah, I'm Don Marshall. Earlier on, you were talking about how it's important that you ensure that education is appropriate for all children, which I think is a really good thing. And I just want to ask the question that how is the current sex education material from RHSP appropriate for any child, let alone all children? And I'm talking particularly about the lessons on pornography and normalising it, which personally I'm totally against. And the second part of the question is, as a parent, because I disagree with this, how could I get my voice heard? Because I don't know a parent who actually supports the teaching of that material. How can we get our voice heard to change it?
With a few individual cases today, which I think is a very difficult position for you, and I think you've handled that very sensitively. Anyway, moving on to my questions, following on from the previous question about the sex education resources, and I think your answer didn't actually face up to the content of the RSHP resources. I mean, just to go through a few of the things very, very quickly. I mean, right at the beginning of primary school, teaching that sex is assigned at birth and gender is a subjective factor. I think that's a very dangerous and confusing message for young people, and yet that's what's delivered to all children in Scottish schools. The sex education materials, I'm sorry to have to talk about these things, but this is what is being taught in schools. Masturbation is positively promoted in schools. In high schools, licking the anus is...
Remember that we are going live out here. This is
okay, if this...
No,
this is what's being taught in schools. If this is not suitable to talk about with a group of adults, how can it possibly be suitable to talk about in schools? Yes, on the internet, yeah, that's fine. Right, so to continue, I'm not going to be stopped. So that's presented as a perfectly valid sexual practice. Anal sex is illustrated by a video of a banana being dipped into Nutella and then withdrawn. Pornography, Right, pornography. No, I'm going to say here, this is what's being taught in schools. Pornography is not just taught about, it is positively promoted in these materials. It is positively promoted as something beneficial and helpful. Different genres of pornography are also recommended to pupils. Such as, again, my question very soon.
Please.
I'm just referring to the resources. Mr. Swinney says he's watched them. I'm just pointing out what's in them. For example, it's recommended that pupils explore, for example, facial pornography, which involves ejaculation onto the face. I think it's disgusting. It talks about... Okay, what I'm talking about is what's being taught in schools. And if I'm about to get to a question, if I haven't been silent, I'm trying to speak up on behalf of innocents and youth in our schools that's been corrupted by these materials. I will not be silenced.
What's the question?
And my question is...
I'm not asking you to be silenced, but please.
Well, where's the microphone then?
If you'll ask your question.
I'll ask my question.
Nobody's going to take the microphone off yet, but please.
Okay, this situation here. Okay, this situation. I am outlining the question. Please. I am outlining the contents of the Scottish Government sex education resources. That's what I have done. I will now ask my question. My question to Mr. Swinney. These materials are not educational, they're corrupting of children. And my question is, having heard some of the detail of the content, I now invite you to re-endorse them, reaffirm your endorsement of them, as you did earlier on.
Lastly, gentlemen's comments about relationships, sexual health and parenthood. Now, I accept that in this material there is there's some very sensitive territory covered. And that's why I answered the gentleman's question in the fashion that I did, that I appreciate there will be a range of views about whether this is appropriate material to be undertaken. A lot of care has been taken and a lot of dialogue and consultation to ensure that the contents of the material are truly age appropriate. And that has involved extensive dialogue with a number of organisations whose confidence I have wanted to make sure was in place around these materials. And one of the most significant points that has driven this debate has been, what do we need responsibly to ensure young people are equipped to handle from the world that is swirling around about them? It's promoting nothing.
As a process, and the organisation Stonewall, of course, was right at the heart of that, and to this day does very good work for people who rely on its services and its...
At the end of the day, masturbation is a safe and healthy activity, so put on some music, light those candles, and have yourself a good night.
Hey you, my name is Thomas Tomscott-Ridgell, and pornography is as fun to watch as it is hard to forget. So much flesh. The whole purpose of pornography is to arouse us, to get us sexually excited, and that's great because using your actual imagination is hard work. Porn is great to watch while we're getting intimate with ourselves because it doesn't just turn us on, it also distracts us from how stupid we look while we're doing it. If you want to see more than straight white people getting it on, you might have to be a little more specific. There are plenty of types of porn, including but not limited to softcore, hardcore, lesbian, thespian, interracial, facial,
And only 40% of women have tried anal.
It is equipping young people with a knowledge and an understanding of what they can make their judgments about as responsible citizens in our society.
Right, and I said, this is going out live, people will see this. Right, and they went, but we're adults, they said, and you think this is acceptable to be saying this to children, but you're saying that we can't talk about this, you know, amongst adults.
Yeah,
right?
that was really
They're
terrible.
off their head, and they're doubly off their head if they think that we as parents and grandparents are going to let them away with it.
Well, you can thank the Scottish Government for wanting to be ultra progressive. They have recently voted in Parliament to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, which gives parents a way to sue local authorities for breaching the rights of the children under the UN Convention. And for instance, what you just said about a little girl who's not going to the toilet because she doesn't feel comfortable, that breaches her rights to privacy under the UN Convention. This is what we wrote about in our assessment. We established that the guidance, that the original guidance, and I'm quite sure that if I count these up, it will be several articles again under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child which are not respected by this new guidance. And one of them is ignoring the parents, picking them off one by one. Because there are 2 articles in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that are specifically about the parents' responsibilities to act in the best interests of their child, to support their child in exercising their rights under the UN Convention. But we don't even have to go to the UN Convention. The Scottish Building Regulations for school buildings, they make single-sex toilets mandatory above the age of 8. So if you were, the only trouble, of course, with suing anybody is that you need to have money, and we all know what happened to legal aid, which makes it almost impossible for any of us to sue independently. But these are the kind of thing, that's exactly the kind of thing that you should go and speak to your MSP about.
My MSP is a newbie. She just came in.
You have 8. You have 8.
But she's my constituency one.
Doesn't matter. You have 8 for your region, and every single one of them can do constituency business for you.
I'll get round them all, but I wanted to know what her opinion was on this.
Yeah.
Right? And also about the materials for children with special educational needs. Right? Because you cannot get a hold of them for love nor money. They are password protected, even at the Scottish Parliament. Right? First of all, she was embarrassed and she said she hadn't read any of the materials. Right? And she said she would have to get back to me, you know, later on about it. This has been like a kind of long-going thing, you know, you speak to the MPs, you speak to, right? And it is the total runaround. Right? Now, for example, even the stuff that you can get your hands on, I spoke to a police officer, right? Showed him materials, his eyes were out on orchid stalks, and I said to him, can you explain to me, right? My next door neighbour has these materials and showed them to my grandchild, right? What would you do? Right? He said, I would have a riot band down here and I'd be arresting them for grooming. I said, well, I'd like you to explain to me what the difference is when these materials have been disseminated in a school. What makes them bomb-proof? Right, that they, you know, that they're getting.
There is I think Eva is going to talk about this a wee bit more, but there is a real problem at the moment with the Scottish Government in this respect. The guidance at various points here suggests that children should be keeping secrets with the teachers. And I know this actually happens in our schools. It has been happening for years that, for instance, a child is socially transitioned at school. This is kept from the parents, and then the head teacher reminds the form teacher to make sure that she uses the original name of the child and the correct pronouns, so the parents are not let in on this. So that also is normally under safeguarding principles defined as grooming.
That goes against child protection.
Encouraging children to keep secrets with another adult. It also actually, to be fair, puts the teacher under enormous pressure. Because they actually have line managers, they have a safeguarding lead at school, they have procedures to follow. Which is, I think, a big part of why the Union for the Secondary Teachers, the Secondary Teachers Association, said this is not fit for purpose. I just want to finish with...
Before you move on, what would the penalty be for the teacher if she refused and told the parents that the school was allowing our child to transition without her knowledge? What would the penalty be for that teacher?
Well, I'm quite sure that if that's what the head teacher truly believed she shouldn't be doing, then she would be disciplined, or he or she.
You could be disciplined,
yeah.
And the outcome of a disciplinary is that you could get a warning, or you could have your GTC registration taken from you, so you're not fit to teach.
Even though it's against the rights of the child?
Unfortunately, that's where we are right now. So
I met a young teacher, right, working in Renfrewshire, and she was telling me that they had 6 trans children in the school. And I said, so what are you doing about it? You know, are you sending them to camps? She said 5 of them have serious problems on the autistic spectrum, and the 6th has got mental health problems. And I went, but what are you doing? She said, I can't do anything. I'm a single parent. I need my job. They'll sack me.
Yeah, it must be very stressful for the teachers and those circumstances.
Yes,
and
we know
that's a huge stress at work.
Because we got contacted by teachers sharing that this puts them under enormous pressure, and the worst thing about it is they know they're failing kids.
Yeah.
Because they are. So I'm going to finish off with 2 things that are particularly important for girls. The first thing is that Article 39 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child obliges states and state actors, which in this case would be schools, to support a child who's been a victim of abuse, to support them in their well-being, to feel safe and to recover. Now, that's not possible when you're denying girls the space where they feel safe when they're going to the toilets or when they're getting changed. If you are making them change with boys or using the toilets with boys, or in this situation, if you're completely having mixed sex toilets where there is absolutely nowhere they can go to feel safe. And forcing a child like that to disclose abuse just so she can have a safe space is of course damaging to the child because it can be re-traumatizing. And for some children it's not safe to disclose abuse. Some children don't understand it. If you talk to victims of child abuse, to adult victims of child abuse, they will very often tell you they had no understanding about their rights to boundaries around their own body. So it's actually up to us to protect these children. And it isn't just girls, it is predominantly girls, but it isn't just girls, it's also boys who need to feel safe and protected in this way. And that's also not happening. And this last item I want to leave you with is another passage that the Scottish Government copied almost word for word from the original LGBT youth guidance. is on girls who identify as trans and who bind their breasts to flatten them. Now, we consider this an action of self-harm, and it should be treated by schools as an action of self-harm. However, what the Scottish Government recommends is binders can have a positive impact on a young person's mental health, so staff should allow a young person to decide for themselves about whether or not to wear a binder to help them join in. Now, what can happen with the binder if you're unfamiliar with them? They can break your ribs, and if you do exercise, you can puncture a lung. So to say that staff should allow children to make this decision themselves, this is not something we would do on any other issue of self-harm. We would not be doing that. What should be in here is absolutely a necessity to talk to the parents if a child engages in this, and information for teachers that surveys done, even amongst people who absolutely agree with all of this, with young women and girls who bind their breasts because they identify as trans. Surveys have shown that over 97% of them report negative outcomes. These negative outcomes, there's a very, very long list of them, but if you cast your mind back to what corsets used to do to women's bodies, that's what you're talking about. Permanently deforming, permanently scarring, damaging, being left with lung damage, permanent lung damage, so you, for the rest of your life, you can't breathe properly. The survey that we looked at in our assessment, although we didn't dive that deep into the data, it also showed that over half of all the people who were asked, or half of all the young women and girls who were asked, reported more than 2 serious negative side effects for wearing binders. Now, the Scottish Government would be quite capable of looking at the practice of breast ironing in African states and condemn it as child abuse and as harmful, and they're championing our version of it in this document.
Is it right enough that this is only being championed in like council-run schools? Because I heard that it wasn't being championed in private.
Well, that depends entirely on who runs the school and whether they buy into this stuff. But even surgeons who do mastectomies in young women will tell you that binding your breasts can worsen the outcome for surgery because of the permanent scarring that this can leave on your skin. So it's an all-round damaging practice. What we should be doing is we should be finding out why girls are desperately trying not to identify as women or not to grow up to be women. One, you quite rightly listed earlier, so the 2 main causes that we know of, or maybe not causes, but contributing factors are autism and mental health problems. But sexual abuse is, we know this from research, empirical research into girls who identify as trans. Sexual abuse is prominent as a contributing factor. And it's quite logical. If you're not going to grow up to be a woman, you can't be pestered by men for sex. And you can at least think that you're going to be escaping the harassment. The Scottish Government actually writes in here that they're very well aware of gender-based violence, as they call it nicely. They have an analysis in here of gender-based violence which completely obscures the fact that predominantly the victims are female and predominantly the persons carrying out these assaults are male. We have a rape a day in UK schools. We have, by the time they're 16 6 out of 10 girls have either experienced or witnessed sexual assault in school. Add to that harassment outside of school, and it's endemic. But it's not being addressed. It's not being addressed in here because apparently there's forthcoming material about this. It has been forthcoming for about 4 years. So I don't know, but in the meantime we have girls who have been damaged for various reasons, trying to identify out of what must be quite miserable. And we're not doing anything, sorry, yes.
Can I just ask, what's the Catholic Church saying about this? For the Catholic sectors in education?
Right, well, I'm Catholic, and they drank the Kool-Aid, right? They decided, honestly, right, because I had a big argument with the lady who's in charge, and first of all, they've taken the view that because there has been historically so much, growing with the Catholic Church and abuse that they might keep their head down about it. But what was more damning was she said if they didn't allow something in, the government was going to impose it anyway and they would have no choice. So they've had to take some of the relationships materials rather than
because
the
that
sex materials.
goes against the Catholic Church use something, not the Catholic sector, they use something called God's Loving Plan for the health and education, sex education. And there's none of that in it. But that's a concern. I would have thought the Catholic Church would have been more vocal on it.
So would I. But
I just wonder what the Catholic head teachers are saying about it.
a lot of them are just quietly going to tick the boxes and not do it.
I don't think so. I don't think that
I can tell you one thing, the guidance is written so badly that if you were a Catholic head teacher and you wanted to keep everything strictly single sex, you could. Because that guidance is written in such a way that it allows you to do whatever you see fit. Obviously, provided nobody comes and sues you.
I wanted to add, so I have complained to my school. We had quite a few emails back and forth before I eventually got the lesson plans because I wanted to know exactly what would be taught. And they were sent, and it was absolute nonsense, as you've said. And it was full of stereotypes and a stupid video and things. So my daughter's been removed from any of those classes. And I'm sort of gradually working my way around all the parents. But my question is to do with the head teacher, because I'm due to go back in to see her. Because I actually did ask them, I complained initially to the head teacher and then it escalated up to the local authority. And I asked them to define what a woman is. And they said it was not appropriate for them to respond to that. That was my answer. So I took a bit of advice and we're waiting for the updated guidance to come through. But who would be liable? Because when I go to speak to the head teacher, is she going to be liable? If someone complains, if some child eventually complains, would the head teacher be liable for this stuff? Because it's her choice to teach this.
According to the Scottish Government, the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
everything always reflects back to the head teacher.
Yeah.
The head teacher could put it up to like sort of our primary manager, and the primary manager could put it up to the director, but ultimately if there's anybody who's next going to be on the line.
It'll be her. Because I mean, I've passed on the transgender trend stuff, the sex matters stuff, everything, and she's still teaching. So I'm going to speak to her again. But and just with the breast binding, I mean, the social contagion aspect of that,
Absolutely.
you know, and the self-harming that girls, it's a known phenomenon. I think the breast binding thing is related to that, so I can't believe they're endorsing that.
Without acknowledging how bad it actually
And it's the mental health thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, is it still, it's only affirmation in school?
Yes, the guidance does not allow for parents to actually have a valid reason to disagree. Whether that is your religious beliefs or because you simply don't agree that you can change sex. Everything that where parents might not agree with this is framed in terms of misconceptions that the teacher is then asked to clear up, or, as you said earlier, re-educate the parents. So it doesn't leave any room for disagreement.
Well, I mean, I've
But then you've got the hate crimes, where if you do go into school and you disagree with it, then they get you on that, don't they? And if you
Well,
say,
that
people can't change sex, then you are, they'll say, well, that's.
I say that all the time. In fact, I say that every day. When I drop my daughter to school, the last thing I say to her is remember, and I say, no woman has that, and she finishes it and says penis. And I honestly believe that we need to indoctrinate our own children. Forget about school. Make sure by the time they get to school they know sex actually does matter, and that human beings cannot change sex.
I really am, I'm terrified.
I'm scared about secondary.
So many young girls actually coming down with bladder infections.
It's unbelievable.
I would actually like to ask about the RSVP that's in high school. My daughter's 14 now, and they're promoting porn. Sometimes high school promoting porn to adults get them charged for grooming her. I want to know who else stand at school with that, because I'm waiting on that coming up. I'm not having it. I want to learn about porn. I've taught her about porn and how it's not normal, and that is not a normal sex life, that's not what people do. But if it was taught that way, that would be fine, but the video I've seen, it was like porn's great, you can learn it and you want to know the porn.
Yeah, believe it or not, that RS relationship, sexual health and parenting, yeah, that guidance is actually what's left after years of women's rights campaigners telling them to change it and working with them to change it. Right. So it actually started out worse than that, if you believe it. What I would be tempted to do in your situation is actually report it to the police.
Yeah. Well, that's what I wonder, because I'm definitely...
That's what I would just do. I would just say, I think this is grooming, I think this is inappropriate, I didn't give my consent to this, my child didn't give her consent to this. So...
Yes, I've already had my 7-year-old come home and tell her she's bisexual, because she plays with both boys and girls. And I had to then explain sexuality to my 7-year-old, she's not a sexual being.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean the teaching materials, there's lots of it in there that is inappropriate and once again really contradictory and confusing, especially on gender stereotypes, and then identifying as trans. They just mix all of that up. Yeah, but it's also concerning because on porn, especially on porn, there would have been an opportunity to raise the issue of women being exploited. Yeah. And the changing nature of porn over the last 25 years, as well as the damage it does to young men, and how that already has had a measurable influence on the relationships of young men and women, with the rise in violence within relationships. And none of that is in there.
Yeah, no.
It's completely missed out.
The last thing she wants to get me to say is, that I did, is if your dad's ever done anything like that, you've got to exempt your dad. And she takes the man, she's got that way, but how else should you explain it to her?
I've only 2 more things to say, about it. I'm sorry if I fall, but I really feel passionately about this. Right. The people who wrote the sex education materials, right, were the usual suspects. It was Stonewall, it was LGBT, it was Gender, it was Scottish Trans Alliance, and it was the Equality Network. What they managed to do with their diagrams and their labels was they missed out the cervix completely as being part of, women's reproductive organs. And what they did manage to do was put in the anus and the rectum as being part of the female reproductive system. And I suppose that's what you get if you're going to get organisations that represent adult you know.
It's probably been written by some guy that's
It
never
was.
been anywhere near a
It
woman.
actually was, and I mean, I've got to try to take his name off it, right? But unfortunately, when the letters come through from Shirley Ann, there was 5 different drafts of it, right? Before you got the letter that was signed, and some of the names were left in, right? And they didn't realise that they gave me it. So this is for after. And the other thing is, this is my last point. He's talking about moving on. Rhiannon Spear. Rhiannon Spear is on the Education Committee in Glasgow. Rhiannon Spear is the councillor who took in a prostitute who beats guys up, you know, for a living, and put it forward as being sex work is work and girls could consider it. Rhiannon Spear is now in charge or on the board of a group called TIE. Time for Inclusive and for, you know, Education. And I went along to Hustings and she's there and all that kind of thing. I thought, okay then, let's have, you know, a conversation about this. And I said to her, what about this thing where you're actually advertising and saying that anal sex is okay for 13 and 14-year-old girls as long as they use plenty of lube? And you illustrate it by using a banana and sticking it in a, you know, a jar of Nutella, and you think that's funny. And she said, well, you know, there's some teenagers are using it as a method of contraception. I went, have you lost your mind? I said, have you not heard of seepage from the bowel getting into the female reproductive tract and rendering them infertile or sterile? And an answer to that was, you're just a homophobe. So I'm a homophobe, right? I'm a trained natural family planning tutor. Women would come to me when they're trying to get pregnant. Right? Teach them all about how everything works. She's calling me a homophobe because I'm trying to say to her, what are you doing about this practice that's going to seriously damage teenage girls? And they might not know about it until they're in their 20s and they want to try and start a family and they've got to have IVF or assisted pregnancy. Right? The people who are running this are not right in the head. Homophobia, right, being challenged. Right? Scottish Government says that 47% of children in school have experienced bullying, but only 7% would have put it down to homophobia, which means they're neglecting the 40% who are being bullied because they've maybe got red hair, or a squint, or they're a bit fat, or a wee bit swelly, or they're part of the awkward squad. Right? It's all been elevated. Right, that's most important, and I object that what they did around 7 or 8 years ago, even 10, was used challenging homophobia as a Trojan horse to introduce trans ideology into schools. And your trans ideology in schools is based on queer theory. You all heard of queer theory?
Yeah.
So, folks that wrote the queer theory was a guy called Michel Foucault, and his favourite pastime was going to North Africa, flinging money at wee boys who were maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age, right, and raping them. Right, that's what he did. His partner, well, not his partner, but somebody else who is also into queer theory is Judith Butler, and Judith Butler thinks that incest isn't always harmful. She defends incest. And there's a lady called Rubens, right, and her claim to fame is that paedophilia is no different to a preference for spicy food. So we have these three. We have the University of Sunderland's Gender Studies Department, right, who have put together all this stuff for this queer theory that has been adopted by the Scottish Parliament. Right? And they think this is okay.
Well, I mean, queer theory just challenges the whole idea that heterosexuality and maybe being gay, lesbian, bisexual, that's not normal. And basically, queer theory brings everything in, and that includes people like bestiality, MAPS, which is the new name, jazzed up name for paedophiles. Everything is included and everything is normal under queer theory, and that's now heading towards nursery children. So we really do need to do something about this.
How quickly with this guide?
These kind of policies are already in place in our schools, which is why we have parents being affected, children being affected and parents telling us about this.
But the 4-year-old thing, is that new?
No, that was in the old guidance. So that was one of the things we actually emphasised, that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is very, very strong on emphasising that because children cannot properly understand certain things, what's good for you, what's not good for you, they certainly cannot advocate for their own best interests when they're 4 years old. That's where the role of the parents comes in. Now, the Scottish Government, we have a very odd thing in Scotland. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child does not put an age limit on this. It simply says that you must be aware that a child, as it develops more capabilities to act in its own best interests, to be aware of its rights and to champion its own rights. But it doesn't say, like the Scottish Government does in this document, that if you're over 12, you're assumed to be able to do these things. Now, if you think about your own children, that's true for some. And it's true for some 10-year-olds. And it's not true for some 15-year-olds. So there's this broad brush, if you're over 12, you can do this, is really not appropriate. And it's not appropriate for various reasons, but as an example, my son was 12 when he applied for his Young Scot card. And I got a different piece of paper from the school from his brother. And it said that because he's over 12, he can agree himself to what happens to his data. So I phoned my counsel and I asked who has made sure that my child actually understands what data you're collecting, what data protection is, what the law is on data protection and what his rights are, that you're telling me that he can agree himself. And they said, well, that's not our job, kind of like, it's just the law, he's 12, so he can agree himself. This is causing issues for GPs. My GP has talked about this at various times. It is a phenomenon with diabetic children that when they hit their teens, it's a very difficult stage where they resent the really rigid rules that they're bound by. And if a 13-year-old tells him, no, you can't tell my parents, then he can't. So that's a real problem with the way this is handled in Scotland, and it certainly is not in line with the UN Convention. So don't be swayed by that if it says in here if a 12-year-old can do that and you happen to have a 13-year-old who's upset. It doesn't matter. The UN Convention, you're a child if you're under 18 and your parents have the right to champion your own best interests for you. So it doesn't matter if it's policy. If it's not lawful, you can challenge it. The problem with challenging is that in the current climate, this isn't possible for everybody, which is why I'm saying MSPs are a good option, because that's confidential.
Are there any organisations that would help parents challenge currently?
If you are religious, I believe that there is, I can't remember who it is, there's I can't remember, I don't know if it's a family law centre, no, it's not.
Scottish Catholic Education Service, is it?
No, it's something else. It's I do know that there's a lot of
Are they the people that help with debts?
That's the word. So if you're a religious parent, if you have a good case, that might be an option, but I honestly, all of the children's organisations that we know of have endorsed all of this. As I said, we were the only ones to write an assessment of this. Nobody else did it, and they've all signed up to this.
Why?
Because they're all funded by the Scottish Government. If you don't agree with it, they stop your money. It was like the 3 women's aid places in North Lanarkshire, and they said no, they were keeping it single sex. So after 40 years, their funding was withdrawn, and their £1.4 million was given to Madril Wadala's partner to run services in that area. That's the man who runs the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, because he's got no GRC, he's still gently intact, so he's a man.
Good. Just quickly, one more question, then we'll need to move on to hear what Eva has to say.
Under the Justice Service, they're saying that they want to reduce incarceration for the under 25s because the brain is not fully developed to under 25.
Yeah.
So how can we be doing this to 4-year-olds?
That's interesting. Age of Legal Capacity Act 1991, Section 2(4), there's 2 bits to it. A child aged 12, which is a girl, and 14 if he's a boy, can enter into a legal contract, right? However, when it comes to medical things, it is up to the medical practitioner present who will interview the child, and they will assess whether they understand the consequences. And it's that simple. And you don't need to know about it, and they don't need to tell you about it.
Hope this works okay. I'm quite happy to be interrupted at any time, so if I speak too quickly or if you want to ask a question about a particular topic, just stick your hand up and we'll get to it. I started work in 1980 in the law, and I thought it might be helpful to tell you the distinction between private law and public law. Public law is where the state can intervene in your family life, in effect. So what you've got with the guidance here for schools, whether we're talking about the transgender guidance or the RSHP guidance, is when the state intervenes and the state controls what happens with your children. From my perspective, what I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years coming out of this government tells me beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're captured by an ideology, and they are absolutely and utterly controlled by lobbyists, and probably to a certain extent by finance. Goodness only knows exactly from where. I'm probably slightly jaded in the context of decisions that I think Nicola Sturgeon is responsible for, because I would put her and the beloved Rhiannon in the same category. I mean, people that have a little knowledge of the law, and in their hands it's a very dangerous thing. So in the context of private law, what you should know is, when I started work in the 80s, if there were disputes between parents about children, we spoke in terms of concepts such as custody and access. And we always spoke as if children were the possessions and the belongings of their parents. Thankfully, moves in the law got away from that, and we started to talk very properly in terms of parental responsibilities and parental rights. So, in effect, parents or people in loco parentis were granted parental rights so that they could properly fulfil their duties or parental responsibilities. And what I find interesting, in contrast to the transgender advice for teachers, is that if you look very carefully at parental rights, what they say is that the parent has the right to control, direct or guide in a manner appropriate to the stage of development of the child's upbringing. And if the child is not living with him or her, to maintain personal relations and direct contact with the child and act as the child's legal representative. But those rights are there to enable the fulfilment of the parental responsibilities, which are to provide, to safeguard and promote the child's health, development and welfare, and to provide in a manner appropriate to the stage of development of the child, direction and guidance. So if those are your parental rights and those are your parental responsibilities that the government expects you as a parent to fulfil, how the hell do you do that when the school is entitled to withhold from you very important information about your child's health, development and, in general terms, guidance? It's not possible, you can't do it. But if you were in a court action where you were arguing with the other parent about the arrangements for your child, a sheriff would expect to know what you had to offer your child and would expect your position in relation to your child to be based on informed consent, where you have complete knowledge of your child's circumstances, and the sheriff probably also has your child's view and intimates the child's view to you as a parent. So in those circumstances, how does a school or how does the Scottish Government justify allowing a teacher to keep a secret from the parents, from the head teacher, from everybody else, when the child's view at the age of 4 or 10 or 14 is, actually, I might look like a girl but I've decided I'm a boy. It's really not on, it's a non-starter, it shouldn't be happening. But in the context of what a sheriff could do if there were an argument between parents, what the law requires is the sheriff takes a decision based on the child's welfare, the child's best interest, not the child's well-being and not the child's own opinion. So the child's opinion is taken, but it's given the level of significance or weight that should be attributed to that child in that set of circumstances, given its maturity, its understanding and its general circumstances, as well as its intellectual capacity and understanding. So if that's what a sheriff does when parents are arguing with each other and looks at a child holistically, how can it be right, again, for a school to keep a secret about something as huge as the child's gender identity? Again, it's not on, and it's ideology written from the perspective of people who do not have a clue what they're talking about, or have a very sinister destination in mind. But that's your lecture on private law. Public law is a different thing, where the state is empowered to intervene, and there we talk in terms of what can social workers do, what can the children's panel do. And that's where you go way back in time to the 1960s and the Cauldron Commission, the purpose of which was to ensure that the state stepped in to help children who were in need of care or protection or who were somehow at risk. But the perspective of the children's panel now, and of social work involvement with children these days, is that you intervene again at the minimum level so that the state does not have overall control of a child for any longer than is necessary to secure that child's welfare. So if a child is subject to social work or subject to the children's panel, those matters are under regular review, because what is accepted across the board in Scotland throughout the law is that the state ought to have a minimal amount of control over a child's life, and that control should come to an end at the earliest possible opportunity. So again, if you've got social workers and children's panels who are empowered up to a point to take decisions about children, to take into account children's views, where you have parents entitled to have complete information from a panel and complete information from a social worker about all the arrangements for their children and everything that affects them, again, how can you have a set of guidance that says teachers are allowed to keep secrets, but they have to keep them to themselves, and they have to respect the views of children who aren't old enough to get their ears pierced, can't get a tattoo, but can decide, actually, I'm a boy, I'm a girl, or whatever I am today. Again, it's not on. So my view is probably slightly different from your own. I would be less diplomatic than you've been, Maren, and I would say that the Scottish Government should be told exactly where to ram that guidance, and quickly. The other thing that I find very simple but also very frustrating is I used to be a safeguarder whose job was to report to children's panels and to sheriff courts about children who were subject to the children's panel environment. And what really pissed me right off about 6 weeks ago was that the Stirling Council wrote to me to say I had to reapply for my enhanced disclosure. I was quite happy to do that. I don't mind being checked up on. I would rather be checked up on. But I clicked online for the forum, which is created by the Scottish Government, so it's a national forum. And to renew my enhanced disclosure, I had to give my first name and my surname and my date of birth and my gender. So obviously I've replied to Stirling Council saying, Can you fill in your form? Because I've not got a gender. I've got sex. So can you fill the form out for me and confirm to me that I can complete it with my sex? Response, can you process your application, Eva, because you've not filled in the form? Roll back, that's right, I've not filled in the form because I can't, but I'm quite happy to print it off, score out gender, complete sex, and will you then receive the form and process it? Silence. So that set of correspondence has now been copied to an MP, an MSP and 3 councillors, one of whom has replied and said, that's great, you're looking into this. And I'm thinking, get it up, yeah, it's my job, it's yours. So we'll see where that goes. But you might think that that's funny. In the real world, that is a hell of a creepy concept, because there are circumstances I've been in where sheriffs have said, this is a case where the child's voice needs to be represented and the child's views need to be taken by a female, not by a male, or vice versa. So you can just imagine that there will be circumstances coming ahead whereby some man who has identified as female will be a safeguarder, will have an enhanced disclosure that will give him a female gender, and he will then be able to be empowered by sheriffs and children's panels to interview perhaps female children who shouldn't be around males because they have been traumatised by experiences which are the very experiences that led to them being in the system in the first place. So that's what you get when you get folk like Rhiannon Spear, Nicola Sturgeon and others who think they know what they're talking about, basically fiddling with children's lives, and they're utterly clueless and also very, very dangerous. Beyond that, I've said this 1,000 times, predators don't have the word predator tattooed on their forehead. But many predators are predators because they were child victims of abuse. So I unfortunately know some young men who, when they were boys, were very badly abused and went on to be abusers themselves. I can very easily picture some of these wee guys self-identifying as girls and going into toilets and elsewhere in schools, and I'm not having it. So you might think that that's hyperbole, you might think it's exaggeration, but the fact of the matter is that Scotland is populated, unfortunately, by a lot of children and a lot of teenagers who have been the victims of abuse. We know this because we talk on a daily basis about trauma and traumatised children who become criminals and they're locked up and they're in Pullman or wherever else they are, and you've got lawyers across the board saying how hellish this is, we need rehabilitation, we need proper services, we need a whole load of stuff, none of which is happening, and it's not going to happen when the eye's off the ball because you're diverted onto tactics like, what do we do about the transgender pupils? So what we need, and we don't have, but we've got to get, is a real, proper, holistic system of mental health assessments and a child and adolescent mental health service that actually works. We've not had that for the last 20 years. I know a psychologist, a very accomplished man who worked in the NHS and jacked it in 1998 because he saw where it was going, and he was absolutely right. So from my perspective, working in Clackmannanshire, seeing a bit of Stirling, a bit of Falkirk, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt there are children out there that are dangerous to themselves and dangerous to other people. Some of them are suicidal, and they're not even appearing on a waiting list because they're not high tariff enough. I know children that are in care that have got suicidal ideation. Some of them have been very, very difficult in their behaviour towards other people as well as themselves, and they're sitting on waiting lists sometimes for up to 2 years before they get an initial assessment. And that assessment's not done by a clinician, it'll be done by a nurse, but the nurse doesn't want to tell you he's a nurse. He's a practitioner, he's in the team, and you can email these folk until you're blue in the face and say, just give me your qualifications and your experience, and you'll not get an answer. And the reason for that is because they don't have enough clinicians doing the job. So if you really wanted to solve Scotland's problems of this nature, you wouldn't be spending your money on transgender guidance. You would be firing up the number of people that you've got going out doing the right jobs in the right places where they're being done, because that stuff there is nothing other than a diversion which is dangerous, and I would think in the fullness of time is going to result in a lot of sadness and a lot of terrible experiences for very, very people.
A woman called Belle Staffy, she's on Twitter, and she worked in prisons with sexual predators, and she basically said, you know, they'll go to any length to get access to vulnerable people and vulnerable children, and that would include training as a teacher, or becoming a scout master or whatever. And with self-ID, we're handing children on a plate to these people, and they can keep secrets from us, and it's just a big, horrible, hot mess. Yes.
But there's also the gender mentor arrows. I know about Rojmum, who I've been speaking to on Twitter, and her daughter went along to the LGBT club in school as an ally. And within 3 months had decided she was trans, was socially transitioned at school, new Christian name put on the school register, right? Pronouns, everything else like that. She thought our kid was just going through a stage where she wanted her hair cut and, you know, stuff like that. She didn't find out about it until her 17-year-old son came home from school and told her what had happened in school. Now, her argument with the local authority and with the Children's Commissioner is still going on, right? And that's why, you know, she's anonymous at the moment. But what she has gone through is completely horrendous. She's telling me that in a lot of the LGBT clubs, they have people from the lobbyist groups who come in to be gender mentors, adult gender mentors. Now, I haven't got a Scooby after they have gone through disclosure.
There's little pockets of it that you can see, where I don't know if it's peer pressure or this kind of thing that will all be the same. So I know a few families and a few instances in a couple of different places where there's children that are identifying as trans, and they're absolutely not. I'm not allowed to say that, but they're not.
No.
Some of these children are subject to social work for lots of other reasons, but what you often find is that the trans label is the get out. So they might be on the autistic spectrum, they might be subject to some sort of traumatic experience, there might be a domestic issue, they might be being groomed. But we'll just ignore all of that and we'll stick them in the trans pocket, and we'll wait 2 years for a referral to CAMS, we'll wait 3 years for a referral to Sandyford, and all the while whatever all the other issues are being left untreated, unattended, and quite often.
And all the focus is on this, and then they fall in a big heap once they do anything.
What's the end game of it? I mean, is this an exercise in social engineering? You know, what is the end game here? They're after our kids. Right?
Money is money.
Right. Okay, I saw recently that Big Pharma, right, in America, right, the operations, and you have your puberty blockers, you have your cross hormones, and what they were actually saying was that anybody who fancied a hunt, right, and was going to invest, you know, in one of the companies that produces these hormones and linears like that, they could expect a 26% return in their investment. Follow the money. Right? As far as Big Pharma are concerned, it's not morality for them, or what happens to children, or what happens to people. It's all about money and profit, and they don't care whose lives are ruined in the meantime.
It's lifelong medications.
Yes, lifelong medication.
So I was going to say, what's also interesting, and it's really horrible, it's absolutely sickening, is when you read, and you know it's all over Twitter and TikTok and everything else about top surgery and bottom surgery.
And the reality of that is horrific.
It's no unicorns and sparkles and glitter by any manner of means, but you've got your lobbyists or your Rhiannon type people in this world kidding on to kids. Well, do you know, there's all these sportsmen that have become sportswomen, these others that are, who's the one that's going to Brazil or Argentina or whatever to get a womb transplant to have a baby? How did we get to that?
Do you know, I was told I was fantasising about that, I made that up, right? And I had a terrible argument with the transplant service kind of thing. I said, you'll be taking my name off, right?
I had my name removed,
If anything happens to me, well, I'm going to keep my kidneys and everything else like that. I mean, you ain't getting my box where I make my babies, you know, to experiment on it and put it into some man.
Well, you better not be speaking to David Lammy, because he might have to say
But I mean, if anyone is on like YouTube, there's a woman on there called X Ulanzik. It's really unusual, but she takes a lot of TikTok videos of transitioner stories, you know, kids that are going through the like video everything, and she breaks it down. And honestly, I mean, a lot of these children, they end up with catheters and stuff because it's so prone to infection. You know, what they do to them, it's horrific. You know, they say top surgery, bottom surgery, but it's mutilation of these bodies. And they're never right again. And even the drugs like testosterone, estrogen, it causes blood clots, heart conditions. Testosterone makes the voice change. It also damages the heart in the same way. And so they're medicalised for life. And it doesn't do anything, and they're more suicidal.
Disappointed with the end result.
Yeah.
They think they're going to look like a man after it, or they think they're going to look like.
Yeah. I mean, we really need to stop lying to children. I mean, it's not right. It's one big lie.
Yeah. It started, you know, gender reform started off as a kindness, a legal fiction. We didn't have same-sex marriage, and when people that had issues, you got your diagnosis of gender dysphoria, you could sort these things out up to a point, and that was not a bad thing to do for adults. In relation to children, define transgender.
I know, no one can do that.
Can't quantify it.
I mean,
There's no list.
They've defined woman as anyone who identifies as such. That is in the school's guidance. So anyone can be a woman, you know, and it's how disrespectful. You know, we are women, and there are only women and men. And you can't change sex, so we should stop lying about it. And, you know, women are getting really pissed off now, and you know, we are organised. I mean, we're going to be in Arbroath on Saturday talking about this stuff, you know, and we need to do more of that.
See the politicians, especially the female politicians, that have the nerve to stand up and say trans women
Are women. But they're all middle class. They're never going to be in a shelter.
No.
They're, you know...
Yeah, but wonder what they say in private, though.
No, they really believe it. They've been indoctrinated.
And some of them have got trans children, which they keep pretty quiet about.
But you know, a lot of it is they've been sold this idea of equality, and they actually feel like even like strength-wise, physically, we have to be equal. And that's why you're seeing in the MMA and everything, you've got like men beating up women for entertainment. They don't appreciate these younger women like Rhiannon bloody Spears. They don't really appreciate the differences between men and women, and we are equal, but we're not equal physically. But that doesn't make us any less, it just makes us different. But these young women have been groomed, really, to think that that is equality, and that's why they're so passionate about it. But they're so wrong. They will never be in prisons, they'll never... Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. But you know, and we need to teach our girls as well to speak up, although it's very difficult. Children are not going to stand up and say, oh, I don't want... If everyone else is going along with it, it's hard for the children to say, I don't want it. That's our job, and we need to get up there and bloody get to school. And as you said there, what's the best way to tell the government to shove it? That's what... We need to work that out. What's the best way?
We have to get the message out.
Know about it, exactly.
Read the guidance. I know that some head teachers haven't even seen it because it's been buried amongst the millions of emails.
That is so
Some
true.
haven't even seen it. I know that I spoke to a colleague and said, have you read this? And she said, oh, it's in the pile to do. And the to-do list for head teachers is like death by email, death by attachment. And I said, you really need to have a look at this. And she's got 2 young boys, and she came back and she was appalled.
What I kind of think though is that this isn't the fault of the directors of education or the teachers. This is the fault of the government.
The government,
It's every single MSP that needs put on the line. What way you voting, pal? You know.
But it's parent power. Parents have got a lot more power. I know as a previous head teacher that if I wanted something done and I said, please can I get this? And I was told, get lost, there's no money. I would go to my parent council and say, going to ask. That's right. And it's the parents that have got the parents, so you need to get the parents to actually.
Parents, absolutely, I completely agree with you.
I remember having a violent child in school, and I used to say to the children, go home and tell your parents tonight and complain. And eventually they did, and the child was removed to a unit. You know, I used to say, I'm not going to take it personally. If you tell your parent what's happening in the class, please tell the parents. And the parents were the ones that got that child removed, not the head teacher, not me, it was the parents.
Parents have got an awful lot of power, a lot more power than head teachers.